I'm so thrilled to announce everybody sitting to my left, so I'll just move straight down the line with introductions. So first, Dominique Jean-Louis is a doctoral candidate in U.S. history at NYU. She received her BA in comparative ethnic studies from Columbia University. Her dissertation work explores Caribbean immigration to New York City in the years following the Civil Rights Movement, examining the impact of schooling on the formation of racial identity. Dominique has served as a Mellon Predoctoral Fellow in Museum Education at the Museum of the City of New York, a Public Humanities Fellow with Humanities NY, and contributed to the Museum of the City of New York's flagship exhibition, New York at its Core. She is currently serving as a curatorial project historian at the New York Historical Society, where she worked on Black citizenship in the age of Jim Crow. Robyn Spencer is a historian whose research centers on social protest after World War II, urban and working class radicalism, and gender. She teaches survey and seminar courses on African American heritage, civil rights, and Black power and Black women's history in the United States as an associate professor of history at Lehman College, City University of New York. She is part of a consortial faculty in the history department at the CUNY Graduate Center and is an affiliate faculty with the American Studies program. This past academic year, she's visiting endowed chair in Women and Gender Studies and visiting associate professor of history at Brooklyn College. Her first book, The Revolution Has Come, Black Power, Gender, and the Black Panther Party in Oakland, analyzes the organizational evolution of the Black Panther Party in Oakland and was published by Duke University Press in December 2016. And finally, L. Joy Williams is the founder and principal of New York-based consulting firm LJW Strategies and president of the Brooklyn NAACP, having previously served as the first vice president and an at-large board member. Williams leads a generationally diverse, all-volunteer branch which works tirelessly to ensure the political, educational, social, and economic equality of rights for all in Brooklyn. Williams is the creator, host, and producer of the civic education podcast #Sunday Civics on Sirius XM Urban View, and founding chairwoman of Higher Heights for America. So a lot of amazing insight and deep connections to the city here at this table. So just to provide a little more context as we dive into this truly epic history, I thought we might go down the line. And you could all just share, you have this broad array of interests, but what is your entry point into this long history, right? What is your approach to the NAACP? Where do you come at this organization, right? What moments, history perhaps? What are the immediate associations you have with an organization, right, that's so old but still is vibrant and active and prominent today?
Guess I'll kick off, and thanks so much for everyone joining us here today in this room to talk about this history. It's very exciting for me. I guess when thinking about the legacy of the NAACP, as a historian, I mostly think about it in terms of what it reveals as much as what it creates, and it does a lot of both. But such a long-lived organization, if you track their history and you follow its development, you really start to see the history of not just race relations unfold, even though that is such a rich part of what the NAACP is involved with, but something that I'm very interested in, both coming from the museum side of things, but also just as someone who cares about justice and the ways we get it, is some of the forms that the NAACP introduces to the world of activism, the world of organizing. I think sometimes we take it for granted how much the accepted kind of role of activism, the accepted kind of way that it tends to unfold, the process of speaking up for an issue and carrying out the work of seeing it through. So much of that aesthetic work, so much of that organizing work is really pioneered by the NAACP. And so understanding how they're using imagery and media and a kind of narrative and storytelling is something that I always really closely associate with the NAACP. And I think that brings a lot of creativity, it highlights the creativity of African American politics, that we tend to think of political organizing in the sense of competence, in the sense of brilliance and genius, and there's plenty of that in the history that I'm looking forward to discussing. But there's a lot of creative genius as well, a lot of just good ideas, a lot of innovative thought, a lot of thinking outside the box, because these issues are both complex and in some ways unnatural, and so the solutions to them are also going to be complex, but also kind of unimaginable, and a lot of the forms that the NAACP looks to in order to undo some of the most egregious justices in American history are really works of creative art, and so I'm looking forward to discussing.
Okay, I wanted to say that I guess my stake in this discussion is to bring a radical perspective to conversations around the NAACP and to demand a space and to hold a space for looking at movement histories which are oftentimes seen as either or, black and white, Malcolm or Martin, NAACP or Garvey, NAACP or the Panthers, to really break apart those binaries. The NAACP's history is really essential to understanding the Black freedom movement in the United States. You can't understand that movement without understanding the evolution of the NAACP. So for me, my stake in this conversation is to assert that the NAACP is radical history, it is women's history, it is working class history. It's a history that we need to know in order to understand the way to move forward at this contemporary moment. Because the NAACP's history and the way that so many different types of activists use the NAACP as a vehicle towards liberation is really essential for us to understand that the NAACP wasn't just one thing, right? It was many things on the national level, local level, in different parts of the country, for different people of different classes at different time periods in history. So that's what I hope to come out of this conversation.
Good evening. My contribution to this is to talk about sort of I'll leave it to the historians sort of to discuss things in context. But one important thing to understand about NAACP, particularly now, is most people think of national organizations as top-down management, that there is, a national president or a national board that sort of directs further down what the organization or what the issues that the organization or the peoples will be working on. And in fact, the NAACP is the opposite. It is a ground-up organization. While yes, there's a national organization, there's an executive board, there's a national board that sort of manages the national office in the day-to-day, the issues that we work on and the real impactful work that happens in local communities and local areas because we are branches within our individual communities and states and regions. And that's really important to the organization's history, and I think is part of the reason why the organization has lasted as long as it has, is because while yes, there is a national presence of NAACP, there is still down in individual communities and regions, people are volunteering and working on issues that are relevant to where people live. And so the disconnect that can often happen with national organizations or national movements where people begin to think that they're out of touch with what's going on or the reality. And all organizations suffer from that. But for NAACP, because we have built into our structure that kind of organizing and ground up work sets us apart and sort of helps with the work that we're doing. We're able to amplify a lot of the issues that and connect. Our national office then is able to connect how things are happening across the country, affecting people of color, particularly people of African descent, and that they are similar in the same and sort of rise to a level of a national campaign. And then as a current president and having been a general member in a body of a branch, to understand how the historical context and the way that we organize and the work that the NAACP does, how that plays out in the everyday activism that we do with our members and for our communities. Oftentimes we think about the history of social justice organizations or civil rights organizations, and we are looking upon or judging based upon, now, 110 years of context and history. And that is, in that judgment sometimes, it does not always take into account who these organizers were, right? They were parents, they were working folks, they were poor, they were, maybe some wealthy, but there was a variety of people who were doing the best with the resources that they have. And I feel like in a lot of our analysis of our civil rights era and sort of early pre-modern civil rights, and just for framing purposes, I use the CRM, civil rights movement, as like 58 to about like 69, 70, whatever. But then there was all of the organizing that happened before then that led us up to the part. So we only, in our modern context, think about the 60s, in the late 50s, and sort of not about all of the work that was happening in the 20s and the 10s, that the NAACP was literally one of the only organizations that would do that kind of advocacy work, or, be banned from certain areas of doing that work. So while I think this is a really great conversation of being able to provide the historical context, but then how that plays out in terms of branches and the individual members in their local communities sort of doing that work on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you all so much. So we don't have to do every question but going down the line, so do feel free to jump in. And I think also, in our unfortunately brief time together, right, feel free to jump from past to present, right? But thinking of, right, we are marking this anniversary, I would love all of you to speak to, Katie gave us a little bit of this background, violent flashpoint, founding moment, but the mood in this country at the moment this organization was established, and some of the investments and stakes of individuals who were eager to get involved, who were eager to put all of their time, all of their funds, all of their energy into it. And I think as a way to perhaps get into that, specifically this call, right? We call upon the believers in democracy, but what are some of the ways people would have defined democracy, either in real time, in that moment, and with radical visions for the future, right? So founding moment of the NAACP through the framework of what does it mean to be a believer in democracy?
I feel as though I'm going right back down the line again. But one thing that is so important to remember about this call and about that moment, right before the founding of the NAACP, is we're really right on the heels of Reconstruction, and something that I think is important for us to do looking back, and this is more than 100 years ago, is to try not to think in historical chunks the way we're taught, right? We're taught that emancipation happens after the end of the Civil War, then Reconstruction takes place, and then hard stop at 1877, the Compromise of 1877, a compromised election, and then we enter into the period of Jim Crow. You might have heard it referred to as the nadir of race relations. It's a term that Rayford Logan comes up with. But in the early 20th century, it's not a foregone conclusion that the gains made during Reconstruction are over forever. There's been severe backsliding, particularly in the South. We see in states like Mississippi, you go from a 90% black male voter registration rate to a 10% one due to voter suppression tactics that are enormously successful. But even despite all of those severe setbacks, many activists in this time period are still convinced that there is a place for African American voices in American democracy, that the Civil War, now a kind of generation or so, a little bit more than a generation beyond that, that those gains will be permanent, that it's not going to be just a backslide into slavery, that all of the things we know looking back are coming, the horrors of the peak of lynching, the horrors of sharecropping, and all of the things we know are going to take place in the South from the end of Reconstruction forward. In 1909, people didn't know all of that was coming. They might have seen the signs, and certainly there was a tremendous amount of racial violence. The lynching peaks in 1892. So it's not to say that the mood wasn't somber and kind of desperate. It absolutely was. But I still think in this time period, in regards to democracy, African Americans still see themselves as having a voice in that, and white allies as well still feel as though the gains made during Reconstruction, the dream that was fulfilled, is still up for grabs. One of the founding members of the NAACP, founding president, in fact, Warfield Story, he clerked for Charles Sumner, this person who had fought for abolition and then fought for Reconstruction. This was part of a dream that was still being carried forward. So in terms of this, there is a lot of desperate things happening on the ground, and certainly this incident of violence that heralds the call for action is a sign of that. But I do still think among the African American activists in this time period, there's a tremendous amount of hope and dogged perseverance to hold on to the gains made during Reconstruction and hopes to carry them into the future.
Let me add additional context to that, right? So it's after what happens, what are African Americans doing post-Reconstruction that was not a full Reconstruction, right? So they are scrapping together and pulling together resources. They are building whole communities, they're building towns, they're establishing their own economic base, building schools, building communities and that nature. Then we get to 1908. And so in between that time, you have this incredible amount of targeted violence towards these centers of African American communities, right? That it becomes economic angst as well, thinking about the national economy. And think about that every time in the United States there is economic angst, you can chart it. There's also racial and ethnic violence as well. It's used as a tool, right, in economic strenuous times. So African Americans are building their own communities, building their own towns, still facing discrimination, still facing targeted racism and violence. Part of the call is immediately following, and the reason why it was connected to also Lincoln, right, is because in 1908, there's a race riot in Springfield, Illinois, where, again, another tool that's used against African American, particularly men, of raping white women. There's two black men accused of raping white women. The sheriff whisks them out of town because a mob comes to lynch them. And then so the lynch mob decides that we're going to find the nearest black folks and then start tearing, just killing people in the streets or attacking people in the streets, and also destroying their community, their banks, their schools, and all of that, right? So it was so much of in the land of Lincoln, right? Because this is in Illinois, that it pulled the African American community, pulled at them, as well as those, I guess the word is allies, even though I don't like using allies, but sort of allies, to say we have to do something. We have to respond to people who believe in justice, who believe in democracy, that here are people that are building their own communities, that are, I don't know the phrasing of American Dream was used at that point, but sort of building their own and still attacked, and we are 50 years after, and also this happening in the land of Lincoln, right? And so that is the backdrop that they then sort of put, so that's all going on at the same time, that results in this call and sort of makes it more prominent and makes it so that people responded, and wanted to create something to protect and to advocate for African Americans in this country who could go off and build their own communities and their own resources, but still here would come a white lynch mob and tear it all down. And so that is sort of the impetus of creating an organization that is specifically focused, if you think about the mission of the organization that results from there, what are we're talking about the economic, political, social, educational, right, advancement of colored people. Very specific, right, because of that backdrop. That yes, we could go off, we could leave white people alone and go create our own communities, but they will always come back to try to destroy because of, you know, the threat against the economy, because the threat of our education, because the threat of our social advancement, right? And so it was very deliberate to create an organization that could advocate for African Americans based upon those things that there's, you know, it's 110 years and we still have not had to change that mission, that we are still sort of advocating in that way for African Americans in this country.
I wanted to talk about hope and also to think about sort of bottom-up protests that was happening at that time, because yes, there was Lincoln, but there was also all of the organizing that was going on during emancipation and continuing through the Reconstruction era. In particular, I'm thinking about the Black Women's Club movement and the way that African American women use self-help strategies in order to empower their communities in the face of government neglect and an incredible amount of everyday violence in their lives. I think there are moments where there are these flashpoints of violent activity, but there was everyday violence that was certainly key in this era. I'm also thinking about church-based activism and how religious institutions served as ways for people to come together to enact community, to gain, to discuss citizenship. What did it mean to be a citizen? What demands could one make on the government? How could you hold people accountable in the face of the violence and exclusions that were there, and also what was possible? What could determined people do by pooling their resources, by sharing their time, and how could they keep that conversation about what was democracy going? Right, there were a lot of conversations about that. I feel like at that time, which is possibly unlike this time, these problems seemed fixable. They didn't seem as intractable, right? People could think about alternative futures in a clearer way, right? There was more an imagination. And I think that the NAACP was an umbrella to bring people together to have those conversations. But just like every umbrella, in case you didn't figure that out on the way here today, you cannot shelter everybody. Everybody does not fit, everyone does not want to fit under that umbrella. So the founding of the NAACP was also a moment of unity amongst some, but also a moment of exclusion and disunity and a moment of political fissure amongst others, right? So it's important to think about that. And the other thing I want to say is that there were so many perspectives on it, right? So on the one hand, I think the people who came together in a room like this and had those important conversations may have been thinking about Lincoln, but they may have also been coming from being organizers themselves, and many conversations in many different social and political spaces. I believe that they were more social and political conversations in the quote-unquote social media of that time, right? The way that people were networked. It wasn't what it looks like for us today, but people had those important conversations quite often, maybe more often than we imagine.
So on that note, right, thinking of all of these different skill sets, backgrounds, and I love Dominique, creativities, right? The ability to improvise in a way that is sort of audacious and underfunded, right? Oftentimes, I'm curious, thinking historically, but also thinking in this present moment, what are some of the models, what are some of the methods, what are some of the styles that the NAACP is the vanguard of in its founding moment or in later decades that you see as particularly significant historically and as particularly significant as models across the 20th century and models for this present moment? What are some of those disparate perspectives? What are things that people are bringing to the table that really sit well with you?
Well, a few things come to mind right away. One, propaganda, information, like creating the Crisis magazine as a way of speaking to a population that had been kept away from literacy for so many years and had struggled to read and to write and to express in ways that were accepted and respected. The Crisis magazine quickly became a pivotal source for news information and analysis. And I think that spoke to the larger public that the NAACP was positioning itself as part of. I also want to highlight investigations. I did work on the Mississippi flood of 1927, which was a major flood in Mississippi where the black tenants and sharecroppers were held in incredibly unequal and unfair and violent labor conditions by organizations like the Red Cross, which turned the other cheek to what was going on. And the NAACP investigated that. Investigated, chronicled things that they were not even possibly necessarily sure that could be litigated. It wasn't that you were investigating for a particular outcome. You were putting things in the record. You were bearing witness. And the NAACP did a lot of that, bearing witness, giving us that type of information. The NAACP archives are archives of struggle and resistance. They tell us stories that we oftentimes don't get from other more mainstream sources and analyses. So I think the NAACP starting on that model, those two impetuses in the beginning are very important to highlight, but there are many more, I'm sure others popped in other people's minds as well.
I can add, particularly, there's a pivotal moment when NAACP organizers and leaders began, I think it's like late 40s, beginning, 50s, where they make the decision to go all in about voting rights. It's not that the right to vote wasn't part of the organization's model previously or sort of engaged in that way, but there was this like pivotal shift of going all in. And part of what I like to explain to people was that there was very deliberate conversations about that and about that shift, and there were some people who thought it was way too much to invest resources in. But ultimately, voting, which I think in our modern area, NAACP is mainly known for, pushing for voting rights and registering people to vote and, civic literacy, is the reason why that became sort of one of the tactics and one of the ways to engage African Americans and really empower African Americans in their own communities. I mentioned previously that African American communities were creating their own institutions, their own schools, their own communities, but we're still paying taxes. We're still subject to laws of a sheriff that was racist. Still subject to inferior services from, whatever city, county, or town they happen to, or state they happen to be in, and still also subject to Jim Crow laws that restricted where they could go, what business contracts they can enter, all of those things as well. And so the conversation about investing heavily in civic participation happened because they recognized that we can build our own communities and build our own institutions, but we're still subject to people who are elected that we have no voice, that we want to be able to, particularly in the South, to have a say-so, or at least have a threat of a say-so about the sheriff that's elected, or the governor that's elected, or the state legislature that's elected, and putting forth these laws and policies that continue to restrict who we are, how we're able to move, and the economic, educational, and social base that we're building. And so civic participation became a tool in a way to empower communities to be able to protect themselves. That if we have the ability to vote and a voice in the civic space, that means we can have a vote in who the sheriff is. That means we can have a vote and possibly send someone in the state legislature, so where these restrictive laws can be repealed, where these policies can be changed, right? And so in addition to the litigation and investigation that was happening, now this is also before NAACP Legal Defense Fund is established and then split off into its own institution. There were, as I mentioned earlier, these small grassroots folks doing these investigations and these legal works, and then also as we're, in HBCUs, training lawyers and training doctors and training professionals who are coming back to their communities or staying within their communities to add on to those investigations and that work as well, right? So you build up a cadre of folks that are doing this research, doing this work, still possibly working their professional jobs, still, carrying on families, still going to church on Sunday, probably Bible study on Tuesday, still doing this work at the same time, right? And so civic participation, and particularly voting, and then which later became the Voting Rights Act, and later involvement in party structure and electing individuals to office, is all about continuing back to that mission of the economic, the social, the educational, advancement of colored people. It's like now we have full access to the tools that other citizens of this country can use in order to protect our communities and to advance our people. And so that's a significant shift that happens, that it's not just the investigation, it's not just pushing to protect our children and our institutions, but now we are going to walk in 100% our rights as a citizen in this country so that we can have say-so in how we are governed, not just beating back, right? So being able to advance even further. And so, the most that people know in terms of tactics also from the NAACP is protest, is litigation, but it's interesting to know, I even tell my members of the branch now, those are all tactics that you have to use in different ways. If you're always protesting something rather than having a meeting or threatening litigation or, or different things, like there's a different way to use different tactics and tools based upon the goal that you're trying to reach. And the NAACP has been great tacticians in that way. And again, it is local people sort of not, what we now have professional organizers, but sort of not, that, but sort of, teachers and lawyers and janitors, and homemakers who are doing these investigative work, who are doing these, leading these strategy sessions on what the best way is to make a mark on a respective campaign. And I think it's important to know that.
Just briefly, I'll mention in terms of tactics, and I really appreciate what both of you have mentioned about this idea of layering your approach, making sure you're kind of hitting from all angles. I don't know if you're allowed to pick a favorite activist moment. My favorite moment of the NAACP's is one where I think they really find their footing in 1917, the silent parade against lynching, or against racial violence, really following another race riot. And as a side note, one of the things one of the strongest conclusions I came away with after working on an exhibition about Reconstruction, and we ended in 1919, so kind of in this era of Jim Crow, is that we just need to stop using the word race riot because it's rendered meaningless. I think looking at the Crisis Magazine's coverage of the East St. Louis race riot, so to speak, we're really talking about mass lynchings. And a lot of these, we're talking about kind of one night or multiple nights of terror, and specifically racialized terror, where there are these, due to residential segregation, there's the black part of town, and if an angry mob decides to descend upon it, there's literally no place to go. And as long as you're not faint of heart, I really recommend going back to those editions of The Crisis, because speaking of bearing witness, they are unflinching in their coverage of exactly what goes down in interviewing residents in St. Louis, but also throughout. We know just a couple of years later in 1919, the so-called Red Summer, where so many of these incidences of violence took place. But going back to 1917, in response to this one in East St. Louis, the NAACP organizes this famous march down Fifth Avenue, where dressed all in white, to the sound of muffled drums. So we might be familiar with now protests being this kind of chants and marching and noise making. This is silent, this is reverent, this is urgent, this is somber. And specifically the aesthetics of this march. They send the children out first in rows, all dressed in white, followed by the women, all dressed in white, and then followed by the men in the back. Because there's no kind of protesting or chanting, there's also a kind of masterful orchestration of the media narrative that needs to take place. They're holding signs. Those signs become the only voice of the movement because everyone's silent. They release these signs to the press in a list saying, these are what we're fighting against. Print these images. Look at these children. But this is what we're fighting for. So it's really a moment. And again, early 20th century, mass media is kind of really starting to build, and they understand that this could be a far more effective way of releasing a national moment with these incredibly striking images than just making noise on Fifth Avenue in New York where only New Yorkers are going to hear it. And in just thinking more about the national legacy of the NAACP, it occurred to me that those kids who are 4, 5, 6 years old in 1917 are really going to be adults during the Civil Rights Movement. And we think about that same kind of idea of being respectable and that same sense of this is on TV, this is in your home, this is in your living room when you're seeing what the police are doing to us in Selma and in other places. We're dressed in our Sunday best. Why can't we be human the way that you're human? It's an incredibly strong visual symbol. And then on Fifth Avenue itself, on 75th Avenue, which is right by 14th Street, the NAACP or the crisis offices are right there, and of course they hang the famous "A man was lynched today" sign, indeed every time after a lynching took place in the early 20th century. So you think about these visual cues and this way of understanding how the media works. A lot of these early protests really set the stage for what will become really a century when we're looking now at the Black Lives Matter movement about what the best visual is to attach to the particular media. The Black Lives Matter movement does very different tactics, knowing that they're going to be appearing on a boomerang and not on the evening news, for example. And so I appreciate Joy's point about matching the message to the medium, which is a lesson that the NAACP really masters early on.
Thank you all so much. Just one final question. You could have anticipated it because I was going to do a favorite moment. But getting back to something Robyn said at the beginning in terms of breaking down binaries, another one that's definitely worth considering, right, is that of North and South, and urban and rural. And being in the space, right, thinking of the founding of the NAACP as a distinctly New York moment. But I think they even had a quota of there had to be a certain amount of New Yorkers, right? Or thinking of like the iconic headquarters when I move up to Harlem, all of taking over those city streets. But also at the same time, right, knowing that that image is going to disseminate around the country, right? And I remember I had an advisor who said, you don't just look at circulation numbers for the crisis. Think about how many hands are going to touch one copy, right? Think about how saturated these communities would be with these words, with these archives, with researchers, investigators, all these practices you all mentioned. But I think, right, thinking of the organization as something national, as something distinctly New York. I mean, Eldor, you can specifically speak to the New York work of the NAACP today, the Brooklyn work. But what is sort of one moment you'd like to share, right, from a certain branch, from a certain moment? I think yours is so evocative and so vivid, but in that vein, right, one moment that you find yourself turning to, thinking about, drawing upon in this vast history, and is it a story of a city? Is it a story of rural Mississippi? Is it a story of Oakland, right? So perhaps one final thing you'd like to share before we open it up, just a general Q&A.
So, I mean, I can share one of the, so I'm a nerd, okay? So, and because I'm a nerd, I have a Library of Congress card, and when I go to DC, like I'm going tomorrow, and I have some extra time before thing, I go to the Library of Congress and I look at the NAACP archives. So NAACP archives are held at the Library of Congress. You can actually go if you're a researcher there and
They have the flag.
yes, they have the flag, they have pictures, things, whatever. So I'll tell you the story. So a couple of years ago, when I became president, so that was Obama's second term, so maybe a year after so, I remember Mildred Roxborough, who is our historian now, and has worked for NAACP a very long time, mentioned to me, she's like, oh, when you're in DC, you should see, the archives. She would say it to me all the time. And I was supposed to have a meeting with Chuck Schumer's office and they canceled. And my train wasn't for another 5 hours. So I was like, what do I do? And I was like, I know, I'm right by, the Library of Congress, and then I'll walk down and I'll look at NAACP archives and see if they have anything about Brooklyn Branch. So I go in the room, and they bring me, I look in which files I want, they bring me the files. And not only do they have some of Brooklyn Branch files, they have as all that possibly exist. Some are also at the Schomburg and also at Columbia. So I began to look through, and I have a folder that I keep in a Dropbox of branch history of just like images and letters. I have the very first letter where a volunteer sent a letter in 1914 to the national office about creating a branch in Brooklyn with all of the names of the people that their constitution was sent with. And some of those names you can cross-reference, and they cross-reference with old African-American families in Bedford-Stuyvesant and, Crown Heights, so you see this history. And it's named, being in Library of Congress and all of the other nerds in the room, like every time I was like, oh my God, it's the letter of WB, and they were like, Brookie. And seeing that it's not only these historical moments of, the branch in Brooklyn raised money for the Scottsboro Boys case, held teas and fish fries and fundraisers and things like that, and sent money for the defense, right? You see Brooklyn Branch also in the 40s, very active branch, particularly on investigation and litigation. And you see this, insurance company in Brooklyn had a separate window for African Americans for them to pay their premiums. Brooklyn NAACP protests, they end the practice of segregation. So you see all of these, which are not big moments in terms of a national, but in terms of your small community and knowing. We have this great partnership with the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Well, we actually sued them in the beginning, right? The whole history of creating hospitals where African American pastors and NAACP leaders actually lay down in front of the construction machinery because they weren't hiring people of African Americans. So you see all of this history, and it's not just the big moments that we're used to reading in our history books about the NAACP, but you see the very sort of small and local moments that had an impact, right? And the last story I'll tell you is, what year was Brown v. Board? 1954. So within that same week or 2 weeks, the Brooklyn branch was so large, by the way, that at one point we had 10,000 members. Our meetings had to be held at BAM.
Oh, wow.
When we had our mass meeting for the founding of the organization, it was at Concord, when Concord was downtown, not in central Brooklyn. So you also can chart the history of African Americans and what was happening in those particular communities through NAACP branches, right? Because if you look at the branches, you'll be able to see who the largest churches were in particular areas, or, that's a whole history you're able to connect also, not nationally, but locally, right, to see those organizations. So you can see Concord Baptist Church. You can also see a lot of temples that we have letters of, sending their donations and being chairs of fundraising campaigns and things of that nature. But back to Brown v. Board, that same week or 2 week time frame happened to be Brooklyn Branch's Freedom Fund, which is an annual fundraising event where branches organize efforts towards social justice. And because the case was decided and public, everybody and their mama who was in the movement and also part of African American civic life and political life and also entertainment life came to that Freedom Fund. So they came there, and there's a note in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, which is a newspaper at the time, that said, and the Negroes celebrated into the night, right? And there's Moms Mabley did a set. All of these, artists were part of that event, and just like, this, again, documenting of African American life is like, we just had this huge breakthrough. Everybody go meet at Brooklyn NAACP's, dinner, right? And then everybody there at the same time. So it's also being able to, through that history, not only chronicle the struggle, but also being able to identify parts of African American life and community, and then also the institutions and the people that were important to that local community at the time. It becomes a time capsule, not only in the crisis, but also in the work of that branch. And then it's a different narrative. The narrative I have about the 19th Amendment now is from the Crisis magazine that did a report talking about, because also remember, after the 19th Amendment is passed, it's also the first presidential election where women can vote, right? And so there is an article of that in the Crisis about this, talking about African American women registering to vote for the first time. So they're telling the story of the 19th Amendment not through a white suffragist lens, but through the lens of African American women. And there is a story talking about in places like Florida, think about how important Florida is in elections now, Louisiana, there were actually more African American women who registered to vote than white women, and actually turned out more than they did, right? So that's a different narrative that you've probably never heard of, right? And that they had to, often some counties in Louisiana and Florida said that black women couldn't register until all of the white women in the county had registered, so that they were staying in line for 2 and 3 days, in order to register. Like, that's a story that you don't hear of when you're talking about the suffragist movement and talking about the passage of the 19th Amendment. So the discussion about how important the crisis becomes of not only bearing witness, but being able to talk about our victories, being able to talk about how we engage is extremely important, and the reason why we have to revisit those.
I'll try to be brief. And speaking of the crisis, another kind of favorite visual moment of mine is, like all great series, the crisis has a spin-off. And it's called Brownie's Book, and it's edited by Harlem resident Jessie Redmond Fawzet. Not sure if she Frenchifies it or not, but in any case, it's the crisis for kids, and it features kids across the country, stories of African American history, but also photos. It's just chubby black babies as far as the eye can see. And interestingly enough, it runs during the Harlem Renaissance, and we can talk more about the NAACP during the Harlem Renaissance, but I myself am a historian of education, but I'm quickly realizing that I'm really a historian of youth. I really care a lot about the ways that young people express themselves. And in fact, Jessie Redmond Fawzet was quite young when she was editing Brownie's book. And her compatriots at the time were people like Zora Neale Hurston, these very young artists in the Harlem Renaissance talking about childhood and talking about the future they wanted to see, and coming back to the imagination that Robyn was speaking about. There's a way that the NAACP has always been very simultaneously invested in youth expression and fearful of it. And I would love to talk more about this in the Q&A, but I think that young energy of both the people inside it and the messaging and the imagery of the NAACP has been so central to the kind of activism that it puts forth, and also the way it makes America think about itself. There's a reason why Brown v. Board involves a little black girl and Ruby Bridges, and it's a terrific book right now called The Girl Stands at the Door by Rachel Devlin that gets at this as well. But harboring that sense of who is a citizen and what does the potential of American citizenship look like, the fact that it's always young black girls, I think it speaks volumes, and the NAACP comes back to this again and again.
Okay, just briefly, I want us to go to North Carolina, to Monroe, North Carolina in the 1950s, where Robert Williams comes home from war and he revitalizes the NAACP chapter in order to address some of the inequalities that he sees around him. He's part of a wave of veterans who come back from war, who are newly empowered, who have experienced life differently, who have experienced race relations in international context that have broadened their perspective and reinfused their stores of hope. So Robert Williams comes back and he revitalized the NAACP chapter, which is not defunct because of lack of interest, but because of the violence and terrorism that people who were involved with the NAACP faced in this period. So he organizes people and he works with former veterans in particular, and he's able to gain victories. So they desegregate a local swimming pool, which is so essential, in the heat of the South, for black children to have places of leisure that can allow them to congregate, to socialize, and to also enjoy the public, presence of a public swimming pool. They also work on different elements, such as the kissing case in 1958, which 2 young African-American boys are accused of rape for being kissed on the cheek by a young white girl during childhood play. But there was no innocent childhood play in Jim Crow America. Everything was very racialized, and these moments were heavily penalized, and there was no such thing as black innocence. So Robert Williams organizes around the kissing case, gaining international exposure all around the world in the context of the Cold War, when the world is looking to the United States, which is promoting itself as this harbinger of democracy, and whose public face is now being smeared by the reality of inequality and racial violence. So Robert Williams uses that context to shine those lights. He's a member of the NAACP, but he soon, as his tactics diversify, and he continues to face one of the most organized Klan resistance at that time, he moves towards armed self-defense, organizing self-defense brigades amongst those very veterans who have that military experience. As a result of this, he comes into conflict with the NAACP leadership, and he is eventually expelled from the NAACP. He moves on to writing a very well-known book called Negroes with Guns, which had a big influence on later radicals. He goes off to Cuba after the Cuban Revolution. He creates a radio program called Radio Free Dixie, and he too is the history of the NAACP and all the places that the NAACP took people. Right, it took people through embracing different strategies and tactics along a spectrum of nonviolence to self-defense. It took people from a place like Monroe, North Carolina, to Cuba, and Robert Williams would eventually end up in Tanzania. He would go to Vietnam. He would spend many years in China. It took people to the world, right, in very key ways as well. So the NAACP was an important vehicle that people tried to infuse with their own politics to the extent that they could. Now, sometimes this ran afoul of the national but sometimes these local NAACP chapters enjoyed an autonomy and a freedom that allowed them to move along the question of liberation and of freedom in these local contexts, in spaces and places where African Americans were terrorized, economically disfranchised, politically powerless, and all of that. So the NAACP became that kind of place. And I think that's so important to note because oftentimes the NAACP is seen as the most conservative person in the room, right? But yet when we think about that history and the violence of what it meant to even say that you were an NAACP member at the risk of your very life, even if all you were doing was trying to desegregate a swimming pool, trying to ensure that young Black children were kept out of the jaws of, incarceration for innocent child's play. That those moments, the NAACP stood strong in those moments, and they contributed mightily to this long history of Black radicalism.
Thank you all so much. I think we should open it up now to the audience.
Does anyone have a question?
I thought something you said, excuse me, Spencer. I thought about something you said about the way you were in the past, politically, now in the future, now today. It seems that maybe because the better state of technology and improved living conditions, a lot of politics has become trendy and fashion statement instead of down to earth politics, down to earth issues. And it's like people, it's like the blind leading the blind means a lot more today than it did before in many ways. I think, and I don't know too much else to say really right now, so I'll just say I was saying about where our society's going in the world, in the country. So I don't know if there's hope, I just like to hope there's hope.
Thank you for that comment. I wish that being political was trendy. I'm excited to see everyone in this room battling the rain on this evening to hear this history. I think this is a moment where people are wanting to do more, willing to hear more, willing to open their minds, to invest a little more of their time in gatherings where they can rub shoulders with actual people and have actual conversation. So I think this is kind of a moment of encouragement. And the NAACP at its heart was an organization. It wasn't a mood, it wasn't a gathering. People didn't decide to gather every year. They created an organizational structure where people were responsible to each other, where people decided on campaigns and moved towards them, where they set goals and did that. This is a time period where you have a lot of outrage, but not a lot of organization. We are outraged, but we have not taken that outrage and poured it into any organization, whether it be our religious groups, our formal politics, our grassroots politics, volunteer, whatever. Organization is on the decline even as outrage continues. So that is something, I think that is the legacy of the NAACP, of organization, of bringing people together, setting goals, and being part of a structure that you're accountable to, so that you can be part of that collective force of history.
To add something to that about accountability, I think that's really distinct and important talking about this moment and talking about the history of NAACP. I have this conversation often with some younger organizers and other folks now where you talk about who they wake up and they decide I'm going to do something and then they go create something new instead of investing in organizations or structures that already exist. And think about that also that there's a lot of now competition of different organizations and spaces where you can organize. There's different outlets, there's different places you can be. But think about a Jim Crow society. Think about, blatant levels of racism and sort of a different code of who you are as an African American, where you can be, where you can go, and what institutions you can belong to or be at. And so there's a small community in which you can operate. Two, the NAACP in a lot of instances was the only organization outside of church, outside of your school or something that existed, and was the only place that you could go to exert doing social justice work or trying to beat back Jim Crow or racial segregation. Now, and I'm not talking about in terms of competition of like competition for business, I'm just saying it's competition in general. Like now you have NAACP and Color Change and ACLU and, well, ACLU is about to say, but you sort of have more organizations that exist that you can tap into, you can decide to go and, go back and forth depending on your style of how the level of involvement that you want to belong in. But there's also something about accountability that the structure of the NAACP provides. Even me being president, I'm still accountable to an executive committee. I'm still accountable to the national structure, to a state conference president, to the national board of the NAACP. And so quite often people will say you need another MLK, which I hope we got away from that, but sometimes people are looking for another individualized leader and not realizing the accountability structure of you going off to create your own thing, or when you decide people are questioning you too much or want to see where the money's going, or they, like all of that kind of stuff, then you can just, leave. NAACP is a structure that you have to be held accountable to, right? That you have other people that you are responsible for, that you have to put up or shut up, that that people are giving their blood, sweat, and tears, time, talent, and treasure as well. And that's a different level of commitment for social justice work, because you are now accountable to a structure, you're also accountable to other people and your membership. Whereas if you just create something on your own, which we do need, oftentimes to create sort of new institutions or new things, but then who are you accountable to if you create something of your own? And that's not just for an organization like NAACP. You can think about that in terms of a church, right? In certain institutions like Baptist churches, like you are accountable to a deacon board, you're accountable to your members, you're accountable to others, whereas if you created the church on your own and didn't sort of create an accountability structure, it's easy to manipulate or easy to fall after a founder has fallen. And so there's a different level in terms of talking about the longevity of an organization and about it not being about one person that allows the work to continue.
Hi, Joy, I think you mentioned about the diversity in terms of synagogues contributing. Do you have a sense of the racial makeup of the NAACP in terms of active involvement from whites?
Now?
Any time over the...
Well, yeah, part of the founding of the organization, and that was also one of the criticisms in talking about different points where, under the umbrella, where there were people who said, we don't need white folks to be with us to advocate for, ourselves or do our work, right? But then there were others who were saying, and outweighing and saying, one, we need the protection, one, we need the relationship, and we also need the money in order to be able to do this work, right? And even as you go now, there are certainly, part of the creation of the organization was with African Americans and Jewish Americans or Jewish immigrants as well. And part it was this affinity of the struggle of discrimination, of targeted discrimination, and also the discrimination and segregation that also happened by government, right? So that there was this shared affinity of what could happen to a people if others do not stand up, with them. As we get further, you see in a lot of the campaigns and a lot of the investigative work, you see that there are Jewish lawyers, there are Jewish moms and, students who are also a part of the movement, and also, ethnic whites and others who, working class whites. What's interesting to note, I mentioned earlier about how economic angst is, that period, racial resentment is used during racial angst in the United States, and it particularly shows up when African Americans are coalescing together with working class whites, with poor whites, with Jewish Americans. Anytime that coalition comes together, you see that later, not in a NAACP sense, but you can think about, Hanson and, sort of others, that when this kind of coalition comes together, you see that also in the Gilded Age, right? Where workers, coalesce with African American workers, poor whites, ethnic whites, on the extremely wealthy, extremely wealthy, and I'm talking about Bill Gates, I'm talking about extremely wealthy, right? Are, clamping down on the working poor. This is before we have work days and, unions and all of that, right? So all of that is always used, and if another thing you can chart, is talking about any movements where that kind of coalition is put together. There is sort of this immediate crackdown, this very strong and violent crackdown, anytime that kind of coalescing comes together. And we see that all throughout the NAACP's history when it is working together.
Oh, that was basically my question.
Good evening, ladies. My question is, as you touched on, at the NAACP, is more of a structure. The generation today will look at you as old. This generation wants something new. But in order to have something new, you have to go back to the old, to know how they formed their organization in order to form their new organization and to have a structure. Their whole idea about organization is not the same as when NAACP started. So they have a different concept, and you always have to go back to the past to learn what's been happening in the past to start a new beginning. So I think this generation, if they will look at different types of organization and they want to help to create and to broaden their aspect of something, I think that we have to reach out to them, and I don't know how we can do that. So that's a very difficult job. So that's my comment for now.
Yeah, I find it interesting also is this generational thing that happens. If you look at the history of our struggle and our movements in general, there's always the younger generation saying what the older generation did right and did wrong, mainly what they did wrong. And this is why we have new, and then they become of age, and then they become the generation that's holding the new generation back. It's like this, so SNCC then became the, SNCC now are what, in their 60s and 70s and 80s, right? And now we're saying that they are, it's very interesting, I've been in a room where young people are saying to former SNCC members that they are conservative, that they are old, and it's just like, wow. So it is this cyclical, thing that every generation sort of has this critiques of what the previous generation did, but, we gotta get smarter at the different critique of learning, okay, what can we do a little differently, but also what we need to keep, right? I think about now, we probably should have kept keeping more of our internal economic structure, creating our own schools, we should have probably kept a lot more of that, even as we got to integration, right? And granted, there is some very deliberate attacks that destroy those kinds of mechanisms and those institutions that we built. But what else could we have kept thinking about our generation now and in the future? How can we keep sort of the economic and social development of developing our own and creating our own, while also demanding what's rightfully ours from the system as well, right? So we have to just get better and smarter about learning and not completely throwing away a previous generation's role.
I was just going to say quickly that I think young and old are one of those binaries that I'd like to sort of put behind. Some of the most radical people I know are north of 60. And thinking about the NAACP's history, I have to bring up Ella Baker, who played a big role in the evolution of the NAACP as field secretary, who then played a big role in mentoring the new generation of students who were sitting in the 1960s, who participated in the anti-war movement and the war in Vietnam. So in a lot of ways, I think that there is a real sense of history, right? There's a real sense of history. I believe that this generation is talking and thinking about history, some of the slogans, some of the heroes of the past that are brought forward into today's lexicon and conversation are from that time period. Now, maybe it's that groups like the NAACP are not valued. Their history is not seen in all of its nuance, right? So you're reaching back to, the Black Panther, but never to Ella Baker Fu, or to the NAACP, for example, or to examples like that silent parade, for example. So I think some of that has to do with the type of history that we're taught in our K-12 spaces, right? That's our common, that's what we're all consuming, and that kind of making our historical common fabric. And those organizations and experiences are left out, or they're told in very one-dimensional ways, where all the radicals are young and all the conservatives are old, and all the NAACP is, either in New York as an elite group, or it's in the courtroom, and it's nowhere else, right? It's just Medgar Evers and these people that we know, but it's not about the grassroots. It's not about women, certainly. It's not about continuity. It's not about taking stances against war, or against poverty, right? Against injustice in a lot of different ways. So that, to me, is part of the issue. And I also wish that people would take more of their time learning history, right? I mean, going to the National Archives, I'm claiming you as a fellow historian for putting all that. But this is the information age, and we would rather Netflix and chill than to learn something new about a new organization, to read something, to go to an event like this, to really add more to our data stores, so that we do have more of a broader history to draw from, where we tell the stories to the children in our life, to help supplement what they are getting from K-12.
Just a quick thing to add, I think one of the other generational differences with today that I have known, or ways that I do think that this generation of activists is really looking towards the past, is thinking about a holistic human as an activist, right? So we know, especially looking to the civil rights movement of particularly the 50s and 60s, how many people just burned out. This is hard work, this is grading work, and it's been mentioned earlier as well that a lot of times these people are not full-time organizers, right? They're teachers, they have families to sustain, they have lives and curiosities and, Netflix series to binge, and they have other things they're trying to do. But I do think that this generation is paying attention to how do you stay whole, while I'm totally printing this from the Black Youth Project, but stay woke, but stay whole, right? And so how do you make sure that you can live a life that is committed to making change, but is also committed to being true to who you are and to being healthy, and to knowing that part of the movement is participating in a way that's sustainable, and understanding where mental health fits into that, understanding where trauma fits into that, and rectifying those kinds of things that sit in us that can interrupt a movement. I do think that one of the most positive signs I see amongst this generation of activists is a real attention to no one can do this 24 hours a day, every day. That if we're going to build a movement, it needs to be sustainable, and one of the largest dangers to a sustainable movement is burnout, and how do we prevent that? How do we take care of each other? And I see a lot of that in this current generation of activists who are learning from the past, who are learning the toll this kind of work took on people like Pauline Murray, or people like Rosa Parks, who did this all day, every day, and really were asked to pay really large prices for that. I didn't get that.
Thank you all so much. We do have to wrap up, but let's give a round of applause. So we do have a few minutes if you'd like to just make people. We'll be closing the building in about a half hour. I also invite you to spend time in the exhibit downstairs if you'd like to learn a little bit more about Henry Freed's history. Thank you guys so much for coming.